Hello everyone, welcome to today's lecture on inequitable growth. Today, we'll discuss about global disparities in wealth, resources, and development, and examine how these challenges impact the economic and social progress of nations. Let's start with the fundamentals. According to Simon Kuznets, economic growth is defined as a long-term rise in the capacity to supply increasingly diverse goods and services to a population. This growth hinges on technological advancements, institutional changes, and evolving ideologies. Kuznets emphasized that sustainable growth is not just about increasing resources, but also about improving their quality and building a strong foundation for future development. While economic growth has brought prosperity to some nations, it has left others struggling. This divide is most evident between the developed global North and the developing global South. The reasons for this inequality are complex, including historical exploitation, policy differences, and geographical factors. There are three key factors that drive economic growth: capital accumulation, population growth, and technological progress. Let's take a closer look at each of these. First one is capital accumulation. This includes investments in infrastructure, industries, and human capital development. For example, investments in renewable energy infrastructure can boost economic growth while ensuring sustainability. Second factor is population growth. While a growing population can increase the labor force, but rapid growth in developing countries often puts pressure on resources, causing problems like unemployment and lack of sufficient housing. And third factor is technological progress. Innovations that increase productivity and enhance competitiveness. For example, digital platforms like India's Aadhaar system have made services more accessible and improved. However, when these factors are not evenly distributed, they increase inequalities. Let's take a closer look at some key indicators of inequitable growth on next slide. Inequality between developed and developing countries is shaped by various factors, such as resource endowments, income disparities, climatic conditions, population growth, and economic policies. These factors are reflected in measurable indicators like income levels, education, health, access to technology, and employment rates. Let's start by understanding the 5 important factors that contribute to inequality between developed and developing countries. First one is physical and human resource endowments. Developing countries often have abundant natural resources like oil, minerals, and fertile land, but often lack the technology and skilled labor to fully utilize these resources. For example, many countries in Latin America and Africa have vast natural resources, but the large-scale exploitation of these resources is often controlled by multinational companies, mostly from developed nations. The labor force in developing countries is often less educated and less skilled, which makes it harder for them to convert raw materials into higher-value products. Second important factor contributing to inequality is income disparity. Developing countries generally have lower per capita income compared to developed countries. This is mostly due to lower productivity in agriculture, which is a major economic activity in many developing countries. On the other hand, developed nations have more advanced industries and higher productivity. Developing countries also face challenges due to their climatic conditions. Many are situated in tropical zones, where high temperatures and humidity can harm agriculture and public health. This can lead to soil degradation, poor worker health, and rapid deterioration of goods. On the other hand, most of developed countries are situated in temperate zones, where the milder climate has been more favorable for agriculture and industrial growth, contributing to their economic advantage. Another important factor is the population growth rate. Developing countries experience higher population growth rates, which puts pressure on their resources, such as land and infrastructure. This is in contrast to the slower population growth seen in many developed countries, which allows for better management of resources. Economic policies of a country play a crucial role in shaping its growth. For example, many developing countries adopted protectionist policies that focused on restricting imports, which limited their global engagement. This approach, seen in countries like India, where post-independence resulted in slow economic growth and limited engagement with the global economy. On the other hand, developed nations often followed more market-oriented policies, which helped them to grow faster and build global connections. We have discussed the factors contributing to inequality. Let's turn our attention to the indicators of inequality. These provide a clear picture of the disparities between developing and developed nations. One of the most direct indicators of inequality is income levels. GDP per capita is commonly used to highlight the gap between nations. For instance, the GDP per capita in developed countries like the US is much higher than in countries like India. Education is also a key indicator of inequality. The literacy rates and access to education in developing countries are often much lower than in developed countries. This results in a less skilled workforce and fewer opportunities for economic advancement. Health indicators such as life expectancy and infant mortality rates provide insight into the quality of healthcare in a country. In developing nations, poor healthcare infrastructure leads to lower life expectancy and higher infant mortality, which exacerbates inequality. The level of access to technology is another critical indicator. Developing countries lag behind in internet access, mobile phone usage, and technology exports, which puts them at a disadvantage in the global economy. Finally, the employment and unemployment rates provide another important measure of inequality. High unemployment rates in developing countries can be a sign of underdeveloped labor markets and lack of access to quality jobs, contributing to income disparities. By understanding these factors and indicators, we can better address the challenges of inequality and work towards policies that promote more equitable development globally. Now let's move to next slide, which covers development and exclusion and highlighting key factors behind global inequalities. After World War II, both developed and developing nations saw economic growth, but their progress took different direction. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development or OECD countries built strong institutions and implemented open trade policies, such as low tariffs and fewer restrictions, which greatly enhanced international trade. As a result, these nations prospered due to high productivity, innovations from research and development, rapid capital investment in industries, well-functioning markets and growing demand, and educated workforces and strong employment standards. This combination laid the foundation for their sustained economic success. Let's move on to the next slide, where we'll explore the challenges faced by developing nations. Developing countries often face challenges like economic dualism. It refers to the situation where cities got developed, while rural areas stayed underdeveloped, creating a gap between urban and rural areas. This gap between urban and rural development can cause inequality. Another important challenge is urban bias. Governments focused more on cities, building infrastructure like roads and schools, while neglecting rural areas and leaving them without basic services. Another challenge is rapid population growth. It leads to higher unemployment and puts a strain on resources. Agricultural issues are also faced by developing nations. In many developing countries, low agricultural productivity and reliance on cheap food imports negatively impacted farmers' income and the country's economy. Technology dependence is also a major issue for developing nations. Developing countries depended on importing foreign technologies, but these required skilled workers. Since many people lacked the necessary skill, they could not find jobs, leading to high unemployment. Weak support for the poor was also a challenge. Developing nations failed to provide adequate support for marginalized and poor communities, which further increased inequality. Finally, income inequality became more pronounced, as wealth and resources were controlled by a small portion of the population, widening the gap between the rich and poor. Developed nations built strong economies through innovation and trade, and developing countries faced challenges like population growth, neglect of rural areas, and dependence on foreign technology. To address these challenges, global trade systems like GATT were established. In the next slide, we'll explore the North-South divide and GATT's role in this context. After World War II, global communities sought to rebuild and strengthen economic cooperation. In 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade or GATT was established to foster international trade by reducing tariffs and barriers. The goal of GATT was to ensure free and fair trade for all nations. And despite its efforts, GATT failed to eliminate protectionism, as developed nations continue to avoid reforms, especially in agriculture, which slowed progress toward truly free global trade. The International Monetary Fund or IMF and the World Bank were also formed in the 1940s to provide financial support and help to rebuild post-war Europe and Japan. However, the global economic system faced further complications due to the North-South divide. While the developed countries in the North shaped the global trade rules to serve their own interests, many developing nations in the South faced barriers to growth and economic development. This disparity led to a growing gap between the North and South. In 1995, the World Trade Organization replaced GATT to strengthen and simplify the global trade system. We'll take a closer look at the WTO's role in the next slide. In 1995, WTO replaced GATT, introducing stronger compliance mechanisms to streamline global trade. The WTO was designed to provide a more structured framework for international trade, ensuring that the rules were applied more effectively across the board. Two key agreements under the WTO framework are TRIPS and TRIMS. TRIPS stands for Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights, which sets international standards for intellectual property, ensuring that creators and inventors can protect their work globally. TRIMS, or Trade-Related Investment Measures, focuses on ensuring that investment policies do not unfairly restrict international trade. While these agreements aim to promote innovation and investment, they also bring up concerns, especially for developing countries, which may struggle with the enforcement of intellectual property laws and investment rules. Despite these, developed nations continue to dominate the decision-making processes at the WTO. This has led to growing tensions between developed and developing countries. Developing nations often feel that the rules are tilted in favor of the more powerful economies. Among the key controversies within the WTO are environmental and labor standards. Developed nations have pushed for the incorporation of environmental protections into trade rules, arguing that trade should support global environmental goals. However, developing nations have strongly opposed this, fearing that these measures could undermine their economic growth and limit their ability to develop industries. Similarly, labor standards have also become a contentious issue. While developed nations push for higher labor standards, developing nations argue that such standards could harm their competitive advantage, which often relies on lower labor costs. One of the most significant expressions of this divide occurred at the WTO summit in Cancun, 2003. Developing countries united in strong opposition, particularly over these issues, highlighting the ongoing tension between the priorities of the global North and South. This summit underscored the difficulty in reaching a consensus on trade issues, as developed nations often pushed for policies that developing nations believed would hinder their economic progress. WTO has strengthened the global trade system, its policies and agreements, particularly around intellectual property, investment, environmental protection, and labor standards, continue to spark controversy, with developing countries resisting measures that could negatively impact their economies. Let's move to the next slide, where we'll explore key strategies to reduce the gap between developed and developing nations. To address global disparities, several strategies promoting collaboration and reform have been introduced, including South-South cooperation. By working together, these nations aim to reduce disparities with the developed nations while building self-reliance. South-South cooperation is about developing countries working together to promote fairness and progress. Platforms like the Non-Aligned Movement or NAM and G77 bring these nations together to share resources, knowledge, and solutions. This collaboration helps them grow stronger as a group, with the goal of creating more opportunities and improving their global position. There are key areas where South-South cooperation is focused. These include agriculture, where countries share farming techniques to boost food security, industry, helping to create jobs and reduce poverty, human resources, improving education and skills, and technology sharing, which helps solve development challenges with practical, affordable solutions. The main goals of South-South cooperation are to build mutual cooperation based on fairness, promote equitable trade that benefits all nations, and ensure sustained progress for long-term development. This means creating stronger partnerships that help nations develop, achieve peace, and improve their stability over time. Our next heading is Relationship with Sustainability. The relationship with sustainability refers to how global disparities between developed and developing nations connect to sustainable practices and resource use. we'll focus on two main areas. First is resource consumption. Developed nations use about 80% of global resources, leading to environmental degradation. This overconsumption harms the planet, causing issues like pollution and deforestation. At the same time, developing countries, though using fewer resources, face the most severe effects of climate change, droughts, floods, and rising sea levels. Second is indigenous practices. In contrast, traditional practices, like India's water harvesting systems, show how local knowledge can drive sustainable development. These methods conserve resources and align with nature, offering valuable solutions for a more sustainable future. Let's move on to next slide to discuss some of the initiatives taken by India to reduce inequalities. India has introduced several policies to reduce inequities. Let's take a look at them, categorically. In the 1990s, India introduced key economic reforms to stabilize the economy and open up markets. These changes included deregulating industries, reducing public sector involvement, and easing export restrictions. As a result, India saw better growth, improved resource allocation, and increased competition, setting the foundation for long-term progress. India also focused on environmental policies like pollution control, biodiversity preservation, and conservation efforts. Programs such as the National Environmental Action Plan and city afforestation aim to reduce environmental harm, while initiatives for water conservation and forest management promote long-term sustainability. The country's development strategy also emphasized on development of agro-industries, linking rural industries with national and international markets. Industries like khadi and dairying boosted rural employment and economy. Additionally, the Integrated Rural Development Program aimed to improve living standards by creating jobs, enhancing skills, and improving infrastructure, addressing rural poverty and promoting social inclusion. This was about the initiatives taken by India as a nation. Now, let's look at some community-led initiatives. Community-led initiatives are crucial for sustainable development. Local participation strengthens self-reliance and promotes democratic values. In India, Panchayati Raj institutions, local self-governments, were empowered in 1993 through the Panchayati Raj Act, giving them more power and resources to improve rural infrastructure, agriculture, education, and welfare. Additionally, NGOs play an important role in socio-economic development, focusing on agriculture, education, health, housing, and the environment. They also bridge the gap between the government and local communities, ensuring effective implementation of development programs. These initiatives help create self-sustained, self-reliant communities. We've covered all the topics in this chapter. Now, let's go over a quick summary in the next slide. Inequitable growth arises from gaps in resources, policies, and opportunities between countries, especially between the global North and South. These gaps slow down progress, especially in developing nations. To close these gaps, we need international cooperation, sustainable practices, and grassroots efforts. Countries must work together, sharing resources and knowledge to promote equal development. At the same time, adopting sustainable practices ensures we grow without harming the environment. Grassroots initiatives, led by communities, empower people and drive local progress. For example, India's Panchayati Raj system strengthens local governments, helping them focus on inclusive growth. By combining these efforts, we can create a more fair and sustainable future for all. Thank you for your attention. In our next session, we'll study Unit 8, Global and Regional Dimensions. Stay connected and keep learning.